Before I start, I want to introduce the most important person in this room. Melanie Munk and her wonderful husband, Peter, started Munk and contributed more to the public dialogues in this country than probably any other couple I know. Melanie, we all owe you and Peter a great deal. Several years ago, when I was chancellor at this great institution, Shelley and I established a lecture series, a public sector leadership lecture series. And our intention was that we would expose the students at U of T and the broader U of T community to the great leadership in Canada and around the world, to get an intimate look at some of these people with the hope that maybe people will be inspired to contribute to public life and to try to make the world a better place. And so we created this scholarship, and frankly, it languished for a number of years until, let me say, Peter Loewen took over the stewardship of this leadership series of lectures. Peter was a professor here. He's a homegrown professor in so many ways, but he's brought an energy, an electricity, and a passion to Munk, which frankly I am delighted to see. And Peter, as you know, is going to be in conversation with the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney for the rest as part of the program here today. Now, I'm not really going to introduce Brian Mulroney because everybody knows about Brian Mulroney. He's an icon. You know, if we had a Mount Rushmore, he'd be on it. But let me just say that I'm going to offer a few observations of my associations with Brian over the years. I first ran into Brian Mulroney when I was a student, an undergraduate, at the University of Western Ontario. And he was a law student at Laval. And that was in the early 60s, and those were very turbulent times in Canada. It was the beginning of Maître chez nous, you will remember, the beginning of mailboxes being blown up, bombs going off, the separatist movement. And Brian and a number of his friends took on the task of organizing a conference at Laval, and I was lucky enough to be a delegate from Western there. And that's when I first saw Brian in action. He was a young guy. But there's two things, two impressions I had about Brian then. Number one, he was a natural leader. And number two, he cared passionately about this country. Aided, I think, by virtue of the fact he is effortlessly and fluently bilingual and bicultural. But he understands and understood then this country as well as anyone. I picked up again, some people don't know this about Brian, but Brian used to run the most interesting, when he was a young single lawyer, I'm not telling any secrets, Brian, don't worry. He ran the most interesting salon in Montreal. He was surrounded by all these bright young men and women, many of who've gone on to take important roles in this country, all friends of Brian. And I learned something else about him, and I have another observation about that period. He was an awful lot of fun. And then we dial forward to 1984 when Brian was elected Prime Minister. And in 1985, I was elected Premier of the province of Ontario. Now, Canada is a very unique federation. It's arguably the most decentralized country in the world. And there's no other country that has one piece so large and as important as Ontario. I'm not being a petty chauvinist here, but who has another province nearby that's not as big, but different in language and culture. And how do you accommodate all that? And how do you make this work? I believe passionately in the axis between Toronto and Quebec City and Ottawa, but more so did Brian. And Brian brought in 1984 an optimism to this country that had not seen in a long period of time. There was a sense we could put this all together, that under his leadership, with Quebec and with Ontario and the West, which if you think they feel alienated now, they felt more alienated then. And to weave this all together in a decentralized country, understanding the limits of power of everyone, including the Prime Minister, took an extraordinary act of leadership. And I was one of those who was proud to work alongside Brian Mulroney in some of the biggest projects this country has ever undertaken. He grasped Meech Lake, he grasped free trade, GST, and so many issues of substance and of consequence. And he did it with courage, and he did it with energy. But let me give you my observations from those times. It's not as if Brian and I always agreed, but that's not the point. He brought on every single occasion I have ever seen, and we worked closely in those days, generosity, a kindness, and a sensitivity for people that is rare in public life. If anybody ever had a problem, Brian was the first guy to phone. If your mom was sick, I don't know how he knew these things, but he did, and he was the first guy that phoned. And that kind of kindness and generosity served this country very, very well. So this just a few observations from my point of view on this gentleman who has added so much to this country, whose friendship I value. And he is going to now expose himself to Peter Loewen. And they are going to have an intimate conversation, and then he's going to expose himself to you. And I would advise you, have a go at him. Have a go at him. You're quite entitled. Let me tell you, he can handle it. He's having lots of people having a go at him in his life. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to introduce the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney.
How's that? There we are. It's hard to know what to say after David says that, kind things and exposing. But I'm gonna start by saying thank you very, very much for joining us today. For those of us who have been students of politics for a long time, for myself, it's a deep honor and a privilege to have you here. And for our students who are here, it's a wonderful occasion for them to learn about leadership from one of the great big picture leaders of not only Canada but of the last 50 years in this world. I wonder if I might ask you, just to start actually and reflect on Her Majesty. You were asked to give the eulogy at the service we had in Ottawa for her earlier this week, and of course you worked very closely with her. And if I might just ask you to reflect on what you learned about leadership from her and your thoughts on her, I'd really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Pete. Hello? Yes? It work? Okay, sorry. Well, I should introduce myself. I'm Brian Mulroney, fully exposed. What you see is what you're going to get. Before I respond to that, Peter, I'd like just to make two brief observations. Melanie Munk is here, Munk was one of my very closest friends. I loved the guy. I admired him. He was a man of vision and courage. And it was one of the great honors of my life to be associated with him for 30 years, I guess, both in Barrack and personally and socially. When I was young in Baie-Comeau, there was no papers or anything, but we got the Reader's Digest. That was about it. And every month, a special writer would write about the most extraordinary person I have ever met. And it could be anybody, mostly famous people, though. And Peter Munk was, in my judgment, the most extraordinary person I ever met. He was a man of enormous vision and courage and dignity and friendship. I'll tell you, when Peter loved you, he really did. So thank you, Melanie. And I'd like to say a brief word about David Peterson. David and I worked together, and on big files, as he said. We really, in those days, I don't know what's happened to the country, but in those days, if you were elected prime minister or premier, you dealt with big ticket items. None of this trivia and trash around question period, calling it policy. You know, we dealt with, as David says, free trade and NAFTA and tax reform and the GST, Nelson Mandela, and so on. There was a lot of big ticket items. And he was the Premier of Ontario for 5 years. And our association, although politically different, our association was highly productive. And it was a delight working with him. But I want to say this. In the most important responsibility on a prime minister's plate at all times is national unity. The second one is Canada-US relations. He can't delegate any of this. It has to be handled by him personally. And in the constitutional framework, we made enormous progress on Beach Lake and Charlottetown and others, not ultimately successful, because the leading one had been sabotaged in Newfoundland by Clyde Wells when he refused, in fact, in spite of the fact that he signed in our presence and before the country, he signed an official document saying, I hereby guarantee that I'm going to hold a vote in the Newfoundland legislature on it. And he then, he got David and me and Frank McKenna to go down there and speak to the legislature. And when he thought that night that Meech Lake was going to pass, he canceled the vote in the legislature the next morning. The legislators never had a chance to vote on it. And that was the end of Meech Lake. And I want to tell you, in that whole period, the premiers and I had many, many meetings. And I was able to size everybody up as the prime minister. I can tell you that your premier, David Peterson, was and will be remembered in history as a giant in the promotion and the defense of Canadian unity, an absolute giant. And I can tell you something else. When he left office in 1992, Canada was 125 years old. Her Majesty the Queen was coming for the celebrations. And I met with her before in London. And I told her that what I'd like to do to celebrate to mark the event was to elevate certain people. Usually the Privy Council is just the federal cabinet, the Prime Minister and the federal cabinet. That's the Privy Council of Canada, the Queen's Privy Council of Canada. I told her I'd like to change that to honor Canada's 125th. And I had some suggestions to make. And she said, well, Prime Minister, will you take me through a few of them? I said, yeah. And I talked about Paul Martin Sr., whom we were going to elevate to the position of Right Honourable, and so on. And I took her through David Peterson. I explained what he did, and I explained to her his accomplishments as premier and his contribution to national unity. And I said, I'd like to have you, Your Majesty, not me, have you invite him into the Privy Council. And she looked at me and she said, well, Prime Minister, I think you're picking the right people. And so David was inducted by Her Majesty on the 1st of July, 1992. And let me tell you, as a Prime Minister who saw all of this happening and was deeply involved in it, it was an honor for the province of Ontario to have a great premier like David Peterson. Now, Her Majesty. Yeah, I was called by the federal government and asked if I would. They invited me to London, and then 10 minutes later, they invited me to Ottawa. And I'm from Baie-Comeau, so I chose Ottawa. No, I was invited to speak in Ottawa, and so I did. You asked about her leadership. So my memory of, and I saw a lot of her because she traveled a lot, and anytime I went to London, we were invited to lunch or meetings with her at the palace. She was a brilliant person, a wonderful person, very kind and generous, funny, very funny as hell, really good, and it made it. And she enjoyed people, and she could make off some comments that I won't repeat, but she was a lovely, lovely person. And what I learned from leadership about her was in the efforts to liberate Nelson Mandela at the Commonwealth. She was the head of the Commonwealth. I became chairman of the Commonwealth. Our opponents are adversaries. In this with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. You couldn't get either of them to budge on it. They thought Nelson Mandela was a communist, and they didn't want to do anything. Margaret was a great opponent of apartheid, but she felt we were doing it not the right way, and she wouldn't support it. So that's where I had my big collisions with her. Not always pleasant because she was a real street fighter, but she could take it as well. Always in these periods of intense conflict. Meanwhile, Mandela's been rotting in jail for 27 years. Nothing had been done for him until we got involved, and the Canadians got involved in it on his behalf. She called me to meetings, Her Majesty. And you know, she didn't say very much. She never got involved in politics. But you'd have had to be as dumb as a bag of hammers not to know what she wanted to have happen. The body language was unmistakable. But throughout it all, she retained her kindness for everybody, and she pressed all of us to liberate Nelson Mandela, and she made that abundantly clear. And that's why we overrode, I did, Margaret, on this thing. I had to say once, Margaret, I am not a member of your government. I am the head of a great country, and I am going to place Canada on the right side of history in this. And you're going to place your country on the wrong side. And she said, she used to call me Braun. I said, Braun, you don't have to speak to me like that. I said, no, but the way you speak to me sometimes justifies it. So it got pretty nasty from time to time. And Her Majesty was aware of all of this. And she was in Vancouver for it. When I saw her after this big split that I'm telling you about, I went in to have a dinner with her, and she said, Prime Minister, I think you had a pretty good day, didn't you? So her leadership was, I thought, brilliant, because she couldn't get involved in the politics of it. But she had to move everybody around in a very elegant way so that we ultimately got to the desired end result, namely the liberation of Nelson Mandela and the crushing of this evil apartheid system in South Africa. And as I said before, while we all, I think, worked hard at it, I think she deserves a major part of the credit for her discreet, unsung, but powerful leadership on this issue, without which I doubt if Mandela would have been freed, certainly not at that time. And he and I talked about it many. He used to tell me, Nelson would say, "Brian, tell me what happened with Margaret." Because he didn't know the details, because he was in jail, for God's sake. So she was wonderful. And so when I was asked to speak at her tribute funeral, I was delighted to, because she was one of the most impressive people I've ever met.
I want to, there's so much more we could ask you about her, and I'd like to return to the question of apartheid in just a little bit, but I want to start by asking you questions about Canada and the U.S., which you noted is one of the two principal obligations of the Prime Minister. So I want you just to walk us through how it is you came to decide that you wanted to bite off something as big as the free trade agreement. You'd essentially run against it in some sense in 1983 when you were running for the leadership of the party, but then you decided that you would not only take on free trade, but you'd make it an election issue. Yeah. What was the, let me ask, why were you so crazy to try to roll the whole election on this thing?
Well, first of all, the MacDonald Royal Commission came out, and it was a terrific report recommending the leap of faith for free trade. I had been in favor of free trade. In the leadership of 1983, I wasn't going to get caught they wanted to kill me off in the leadership race. I wasn't going to get caught in sticking out like a sore thumb. So I said, no, we'll deal with that later. But I had always been in favor of free trade. And in fact, Crosby came out in favor. John, as I said after, John was the only honest guy in the race. Because he not only believed in it, but he spoke out in favor of it. But no, I met with Reagan, President Reagan, wonderful fellow, great friend of Canada. And I met with him, of course, many, many times. But we met in the Chateau Frontenac on St. Patrick's Day in 1985. And I said to him privately, I want a comprehensive free trade agreement with the United States. And I knew it was going to be long and hard and very, very difficult and unpopular in many quarters. And, if you ask why, well, Bill Clinton, we were having lunch one day, and Clinton said to me, Brian, leadership is the capacity to look around the corner of history just a little bit. And although I didn't realize it at the time, when I looked around the corner of history, there were 240 pieces of legislation working their way through the American Congress, all of them protectionist, and most of them directed at Canada, from steel in Sault Ste. Marie to fish in Newfoundland and Labrador, everything they had. And of course, we live on trade and we live on exports and the jobs that are created by that. So it was clear to me that I had to seek the privilege of the only free trade agreement with the United States of America, which was the greatest, richest, and most dynamic country in the world. And we had the benefit of sitting right here on the border and benefiting from that, if we had the access. The Americans didn't want it. It almost didn't get through the Senate. The vote in the Senate Finance Committee was 10-10, and a tie is a win. And Reagan got the 10th vote, was a senator from Hawaii, by calling him, a Democratic senator from Hawaii, and he called him and he said, Senator, you got to vote for this. I'm in favor of it, but most of all, your constituents are. Because if all the Canadians stopped going to Hawaii, you'd go broke. The senator from Hawaii came on. That's how we wound up with the tie, 10-10. But it was a brutal thing. Not everybody, the country was split really 50-50 over, and that's the way democracies work. But we persisted. I brought in the legislation, called the election in 1988, and we won the election. So, you know, you say, well, you know, what happened after that? Well, NAFTA happened after that because we expanded it to, we expanded the whole thing to Mexico. So here are the two important things that people don't sometimes appreciate, but they're vital, I think. The first is, when people consider this, they also say, well, how could you be so stupid as to bring in the GST, which was the most unpopular tax in the history of Christendom? And the reason was, at the end of the free trade agreement with President Reagan, here we had privileged access to this rich market. And we're going to sell our products there, creating jobs at home. But there was a little kicker in there. There was a 13.5% secret manufacturer's tax buried in the product, which made our products from Canada uncompetitive in the American market. So it's like stupidity. We got the trade agreement, and we're penalizing ourselves. So I looked at it, and I found out that for 63 years, the prime ministers had refused to deal with this matter. All royal commissions and everything said, get rid of it. It's killing us. It's killing our exports, and it's killing our business. But they were smarter than me. They knew how unpopular this would be. But when I came in, I told my cabinet and caucus, I'm privileged to be here as prime minister, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to serve. But I have to tell you this. I am going to govern in Canada, not for easy headlines in 10 days, but for a better Canada in 10 years. And as a result of that, I said to Michael Wilson, the greatest finance minister anybody ever had, I said to Michael and Stanley Hart, who was his deputy, bring in a consumption tax. My political guy said, it's going to kill you, Prime Minister. I said, I don't care, because a consumption tax comes off at the border. So our products, so the guy in, say the guy in North Bay, who had a small business employing 11 people, when the consumption tax comes off and the manufacturer's sales tax has been killed off, our products, he goes from 11 people in North Bay, he hires 111. And that's the way it went across the country. And so we prospered because of that, and we then got into NAFTA, which we did, and that was a controversial thing as well. And we got into it, and so you say, well, all right, that was quite a burden. You know, what's NAFTA today? Well, NAFTA today is a grouping of 3 countries with 500 million people, representing 7% of the world's population, which produces 29% of the world's wealth every year. That's NAFTA. And the package that we were talking about, Peter, which included free trade, the GST, NAFTA, the privatizations, and deregulation, that package, which came in after the 125th anniversary, it had taken Canada 125 years to generate a GDP of $800 billion. In the next 25 years, with our NAFTA and the other stuff, our GDP tripled to $2.4 trillion today, and creating millions of jobs. So, you know, when Bill, to go back to Bill's statement about looking around the corner of history, I tried to do it for the right reasons. Sometimes I doubted myself because this thing was so controversial. The abuse was so, I mean, I was accused of betraying my country, of selling out Canada. They used to say, Mulroney loves the Americans so much that he wants to be governor of the 51st state, this kind of stuff. It was all pretty rough. But I look at it today, with all the controversy that we had and all of the attacks, and I'm glad we did it. I'm glad we paid the price for it, even a price in unpopularity. I mean, they were, well, hell, in the free trade election, I used to say that my support was down to members of my immediate family, you know. And I called my mother, and she put me on hold. And I'm paying for the call. So this was not a ready prospect. But that's the kind of little combination that put together based on, quite frankly, the wisdom, if I may say, of our old friend Bill Clinton. He was right. Look around the corner of history just a little bit.
I want to stay on NAFTA because we've forgotten, because it wasn't well known at the time, but NAFTA didn't start out as NAFTA. It started out as George Bush wanting to pursue a bilateral agreement with Mexico.
Yeah.
Tell us about that and about your role,
Well,
the leadership you took in that.
That is really not known in Canada. I don't think it's ever been published. I certainly haven't referred to it publicly, neither did George. So I get some information from the government, I guess the ambassador in Washington, saying the word is that the Americans are now going to try and extend free trade to Mexico. So I wait to get a call and so on. And I don't hear anything. And it turns out that this is true. So I called President Bush and I said, now George, I understand that this is going on, and I'd like to come down and have lunch with you as soon as possible. So I think he said tomorrow. So here we are in the Oval Office. And I said, you know, George, if it's your plan to do a bilateral free trade agreement with Mexico, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars and millions of jobs in Canada already in peril over time, because I've got a free trade agreement with you guys. And I gave it the office on this thing. I was bloodied and battered for 5 years. And so we have the agreement. You can negotiate a free trade agreement with Mexico and agree to provisions that will impact what I already have for you, what Canada has with you, and thereby vitiating many of the advantages that we were required to sign this thing. And Bush said, well, Brian, I'm sorry, but Carla Hills, who was they called the USTR, Carla, like the United States Trade Representative, a senior cabinet minister, who's charged with international trade. And he said to me, well, Brian, Carla Hills I had a full cabinet meeting, and Carla Hills has made the formal recommendation to me that the United States embark on a hub and spoke arrangement. We will be in the middle, and we already have a spoke with Canada, and then we're going to do a spoke with Mexico. And if there are others in the future, it'll be like that with us at the center. But I said, George, that runs counter to the whole concept that I put to the Canadian people. This would be a betrayal of what we've all agreed to. And he said, well, I'm sorry, that's the way, it's Carla has put it to us. I said, George, let me be very clear. This is Carla's opinion. I know Carla. I love Carla. She's a great person. But I don't give a good goddamn about Carla Hill's opinion. I care about your opinion. And I'm telling you right now that this is a litmus test of our relationship. And if you persist in this, Canada will view this as a hostile act. we are not going to tolerate it, because many of our secured rights can be destroyed in another bilateral without us at the table. Bush said, he's such a wonderful guy. Bush says, "Oh, Brian, it's time for lunch." So we go upstairs in the family quarters, and then he says at the end of lunch, "Brian, someone's going to call you." And so 2 days later, I get a call from Jim Baker, who was the Secretary of State at the time. And Baker says, he used to call me PM. I don't know, he'd call me PM all the time, not Brian or PM. PM, I got some news for you. I said, "Well, Jimmy, it better be good." And he said, "It's going to be a trilateral negotiation." And he said, "You better kiss Carter on the way out." So that's what happened. That was what got us going. And we were able to conclude that in San Antonio, Texas in 1992. And it's exploded in terms of... Donald Trump wanted to kill this off. Trump tried to kill it off. At this point, to show you how bizarre life is, Trudeau calls me, and I'm kind of like his unofficial advisor on NAFTA. And my dear friends, the Liberals, used to castigate me and eviscerate me in the campaign, including his father, on this. So I wind up, well, David will get a kick out of this because he had a similar experience when he was sworn in as Premier of Ontario. I walk into the cabinet chamber where I had presided as Prime Minister for almost 10 years. And same table, same place. And I didn't know most of these people, the cabinet minister. I mean, I didn't have a clue who, some of them were. So I walk around, I shake hands with everybody going, and Mark Garneau, the astronaut, who was chair of a cabinet committee on Canada-U.S. relations, he was standing where you are, Peter, and he said, "Prime Minister, we brought out your chair. You used to sit here in cabinet?" I said, "Yeah. We brought out your chair. Here it is. And so we'd like to invite you to talk to the cabinet." So I sat down. Up against that back wall, over there, this small room, a smaller room, there are some pictures up there. I looked at the wall and I said, "Hey, who took down my picture?" And it was, "I didn't, Prime Minister, I didn't." So we started like that, and we had a 2.5 or 3 hour session. And I maintained that with Chrystia Freeland and Trudeau for, I guess, 2 years. And we finally got the deal all let me open a parenthesis on this, because it's politics at its best. I get a call from the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the ranking member, Democrat and Republican. And they invite me down to Washington to meet with the Foreign Relations Committee to talk NAFTA and international matters. So I go down and I make one hell of a pitch, if I may say so, for the benefits of NAFTA and how it came about and so on. And Mitch McConnell, who had been involved in this, he's the leader of the Senate. I go back to New York. I've got a board meeting at Blackstone the next day. So I'm checking into the hotel, and McConnell calls me. And he said, "Brian, you made that presentation today?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, my guys have reported back, and I want you to know that I'm just signing a letter on behalf of 37 Republican senators, a letter to Trump saying, 'Don't you dare cancel NAFTA.' Because the 37 senators, of them, Canada was their biggest purchaser of goods and services from 37 states. So Trump got this, and he said to Jared Kushner, I knew damn well Mulroney was down there in the Senate. But, what could he do? The Senate wouldn't go for it. So we had a lot of tough times at the end to bring it to a conclusion. Trudeau was very good, I'll tell you that, during this whole thing. Friedland was very good on this very complicated, difficult negotiation. At the end, it was hanging by a thread. When Justin called me the last time, I wasn't sure that this thing was going to fly, but I told him to try what I did in '87 when they tried to tell me that they couldn't do what Canada needed. You know, Justin, you got to tell them, you know, go fly a kite. This is in Canada's national interest, and we're not giving up. And by God, Trudeau did exactly that and did it extremely well. And so we got the NAFTA agreement, and Friedland and Jerry Butts as well, and the Prime Minister deserve the credit for it.
I want to ask you about your leadership in international institutions. So I think for those of us who watch politics, or as David said, your kindness and your personal diplomacy is remarkable. But even in the apartheid campaign, it wasn't just that you maintained these relationships with good leaders, but in 1987, you had somehow gotten Canada the chairmanship of the G7, of the Francophonie. Talk about how you used
And the Commonwealth.
And the Commonwealth, the trifecta. Talk about how you used international institutions and maybe give us some advice on how we should be using them better today.
Well, you know, people who say that nations only have interests, no friendships, is nonsense. They never have been involved in anything. Everybody has interests, but also friendships. And you can't deal on the international level with any hostility. You've got to try and bring people. Canada's a middle power. We're not a superpower. So we have to leverage our assets as best we can. First of all, that means for the Prime Minister of Canada to have a relationship of trust and deep friendship with the President of the United States. If you don't have that, and you're traveling, you're working internationally, you're a dead man. If you don't have immediate access to the Oval Office and the capacity to phone the President in the middle of the night on behalf of Canada, you're in trouble. So I made it my business and I got criticized for it a lot, for being some obsequious to the Americans or something like that. If only they had seen what really went on in private. But that's a condition sine qua non of advancement in the international area, because the other allies, they know that if you're close to the President of the United States and you've got a tremendous relationship, they want to help you, because they're way off in Japan or Europe, and they don't have the advantage of propinquity, geography. We've got to take advantage of that. So look, I'll give you a little anecdote. Bush and I, leading up to the Gulf War, you know, I'd be down there pretty well, and we went to Kennebunkport every summer, and so we developed some great relations. This is widely known with the other leaders. So because of that, they were kind to us. They wanted to help us. Bush has a press conference early in the morning, and he says, well, when I finish here, I'm going to call Prime Minister Mulroney. We have some things to talk about. And that was it. The phone rings at 24 Sussex. I don't know this. I wasn't watching the tail end of the press conference. Phone rings at 24 Sussex. And it's the president of Senegal, Abdou Diouf. And of course, I knew him well we created the Sommet de la Francophonie, the French-speaking Commonwealth together. And Diouf, I wonder, why the hell is he calling me early in the morning? So Diouf says, Brian, I've been trying to get into the White House now for 6 months. And I've got a real problem here. And I can't, well, I said, you know, why don't you call him? Call them. He said, I've been calling them for months. Well, I said, why are you calling me? Well, because he said, I was watching television, and Bush just said, he's going to call you. So when he calls you, will you take up my case? Which I did. To give you another illustration. There was a guy by the name of Prime Minister Longy from New Zealand. And he was a nice guy, left-wing socialist. But I got along with them all. I'm a house of fire. God, you'd think some days I was a charter member of the CCF, for God's sake. So he says, Longy comes to see me. He had been at the United Nations. And he comes to see me, and I know this. So we have lunch. And I know he's got something to tell me, but he doesn't tell me what it is. He said, now I have got to go, Brian, I got to go all the way back to New Zealand. And if I don't see somebody in the White House, I am going to get lynched when I go home. Well, I said, why don't you have your embassy arrange it through the National Security Council? And he said, we've been trying for months. Well, what happened was that Longy and his government passed a regulation or a law preventing nuclear submarines from refueling at New Zealand bases. And so you can imagine how happy that made the administration. So I said, well, what can I do? He said, well, I'm here to ask you if you would call President Bush and ask him if he'll see me just for a minute. I just want a picture to get it back to New Zealand. So I called. I said, well, all right, have a drink and leave. I'll just go in here for a second. I called Bush. And I said, I got the Prime Minister of New Zealand, all 370 pounds of him, in my study. He was huge in those days. A wonderful guy, but a little overweight. Rotund, I guess, is the proper expression. And so I say, George, listen, you got to help me. I can't have this guy staying in 24 Sussex for a month. He says he can't go home. So he said, I said, do me a favor and do something about it. He said, well, all right, I'm not going to see him. I'm not going to see him for sure. What he did, preventing our ships from using their bases there, this is not going to fly. And I said, well, what can you do for me? He said, well, I'm going to send General Scowcroft, his national security advisor. I'll send him to the executive office building, which is right next door for the West Wing, the White House. And he said, you get Longy down here. We'll have somebody meet him and take him down the corridors of the executive office building. And lo and behold, there'll be General Scowcroft waiting to see him. So they can have a meeting and they get a picture. That's as good as it's going to be. So here I got the problem then. How the hell do I get Longy down to Washington? So I said to the department, get a plane for Longy and get him down there right now, so that I promised Bush we'd get him out of the country as quickly. Longy was a wonderful guy. New Zealand's a fantastic nation. But that's the kind of thing, the small things that trip us up in life with our families and our friends and what have you. It's the same thing internationally. And so if you're going to be Prime Minister of Canada, I'll tell you this, you better know the President of the United States, the Vice President, the leader of the Democratic Party in the House and in the Senate and vice versa. And you better know the interest groups in Washington, and you better be able to move down there at all times. Otherwise, it is amazing to see the paralysis that will take place when the President of the United States either makes a negative comment about Canada or indicates that he's not very willing to help out. And the reverse is also true. The greatest piece of alacrity you will ever see in your life is when Ronald Reagan walked into the cabinet chamber and said, I know you people have been down on Canada. I'm going to fix that today. We're on Canada's side. Get this done. I mean, they just about rushed out of there, all the cabinet ministers and so on. So it's a vital, vital part of the capacity of the Prime Minister of Canada to operate freely and effectively on the international scene.
I've got a few questions on cards here, but I want to read one card which isn't a question, but I'm going to take just 10 seconds to read it to you. As members of the Canadian Mission in Pretoria from 1988 to 1992, during the darkest days of the South African struggle, we thank you for your powerful, unyielding leadership in defeating apartheid and making Canadians proud. And that's from John Schramm, who's in the audience here.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about multiculturalism. I mean, David commented on your biculturalism, which was really something. An Irish kid growing up in Quebec, completely bicultural and completely fluent in both our national languages. But your government also passed the Multiculturalism Act in 1988, and I wonder if you might just reflect on, for us, how you feel when you look at Canada today and how much it's changed since you were a boy in Quebec.
Well, it's changed for the better. When I came in, the Trudeau government was accepting 80,000 immigrants a year. When I left, we were accepting 250,000 a year, and I had set the government on a course, which was then interrupted by Chrétien and Harper, on a course to bring us up to a major population zone. I have said publicly many times, Canada, with 38 million people, has to have a population of 75 million. There have been wave after waves of immigrants to this country, and never once in our history has that wave of immigrants, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, you name it, Southeast Asia, Central Europe, never once has a wave of immigrants done anything except bring two things to Canada: honor and prosperity. And we need immigrants. We can't survive without them. And so that gave rise to my belief that there should be multicultural protection. And so I passed the Multicultural Act, the only one in history. And it is designed to encourage immigration and to protect the immigrants once they're here in their national identities and so on. Look, there's stuff we got going on in Quebec now. You know, there should be, in a country like ours, there should be no discrimination of any kind at any time against anybody. That's my belief, and that's why I brought in the Multicultural Act. So.
I have one more question for you, if we can ask you to reflect a little bit. You didn't waste a day as Prime Minister. Huge agendas, big issues. You took on all the big stuff. But is there any issue that you wish you'd spent more time on as Prime Minister?
That's a very good question. I'm sure there are many. But, you know, we were, as David will remember because he was there then, you're driven by circumstances that occur in your time. Now, as I look back on it, there are things I wish I had done. For example, the environment. We did a lot in the environment, but I wish I had done more. We did. No, I can't point one out, but I'm sure there are many. Look, the international, if you're the Prime Minister, you're the leader of the government. You're the leader of the government in the House of Commons. You're the leader of the government internationally. You're responsible for all the appointments. Donnell Savoie, who's a scholar at the University of Moncton, and a well-recognized one, has done a book in which he says he's analyzed all of the major industrialized countries, and he concluded that, not to say that Canada is bigger or better or what have you, but the constitutional authority in Canada given to the Prime Minister is greater than any other industrialized democracy, including the United States, in the world. So, you know, when something has to happen in Ottawa, it can't happen without the Prime Minister. It just can't happen. Appointments to the Supreme Court, appointments to the Court of Appeal in Ontario, appointments of deputy ministers, appointment of the Governor General. You know, let me stop there. Let me tell you. So Jeanne Sauvé decides she's going to retire. I had extended her. She had been appointed by Trudeau. I extended her for a year, and she wanted to retire. So anyway, we had to fill the post. Raina Tishin, who had been the Minister of Justice, a wonderful guy, Ukrainian, from Saskatoon, Tishin had been defeated in the 1988 free trade election. He was working for Gowlings in Ottawa. So we needed a Governor General. So I decided, I talked to Mazenkowski, didn't talk to the cabinet. I talked to Mazenkowski about it. Said, I think we should go with Raina Tishin as the new Governor General. So I call Tishin out. I communicate with Her Majesty. I call Tishin out to Harrington Lake. And he arrives, he doesn't have a clue what's going on. And Ray, who was such a gracious guy, he walks in, happy to be there and chatting and so on. He sits down. And I'd asked Mila to take the kids out of Harrington, and the RCMP, I didn't want them around, so they were in another house, because I wanted to speak to him privately, because on this one, there can't be any leaks. You just can't, because you're dealing with Her Majesty, and if you have her confidence, you can't violate it in any way. So, sat down. Finally, I say, Ray, we've decided that you would make a remarkable Governor General. And I'd like to tell you this because I plan to bring an order in council forward first thing tomorrow morning for your appointment. He looks at me and he starts to cry, to sob uncontrollably. What the hell am I going to do? So I get up and I go to the kitchen and I get, what the hell do I know? And I get 2 glasses of water and I bring them in and I sit down and I have one for myself. And Ray says to me, Prime Minister, I'm really sorry for this. But he said, when it occurred to me, what would my late father think that I was accepting the position of Governor General of Canada? How surprised he would be. And I said, Ray, you wouldn't be surprised as my father to find out I was offering it. So I walk him out. He says, can I said, you can't tell anybody. You can't, this is going to come tomorrow or the next day. Yeah. Well, he said, can I tell my wife? And I said, only your wife. Nobody else. No one's going to know about this. Okay, he gets out. I walk him out. He gets into his Chevrolet, which is the last time he ever got into one of those. He gets into his Chevy, and he backs it up. So he's backing it up to hang a right to get out of Harrington Lake. He comes back. Rather than go that way, he comes back. He puts the window down. And he said, Prime Minister, would you do me another tremendous favor today? I said, well, sure, Ray. What is it? He said, I'm driving back to Ottawa. He said, if anything happens to me on the way down there, will you leak this one to the media?
Mr. Mulroney, we've never had, I think it's fair to say, a prime minister who's had the ambition for our country that you had, from free trade to NAFTA to the GST to Meech to Charlottetown to our international engagements to the courage you showed on the international stage. So for you to take this time with us today is the greatest honor our students and certainly I could have. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all.